working your composites, one of the things that a lot of beginner artists overlook is the contact shadow. They work with lighting and shadow, and they can also grow pretty good in that. But one of the things that they have to pay attention to, and that you should always look out for, is the contact shadow. That is the part of the object you're going to be moving into your composite that comes in contact with any other part that you want to fit it to sit on or lay on. That could be on a floor, on a wall, ceiling, any other object. Like this image of this egg here. You see from the studio lighting, you see the shadows that you would normally expect from the lighting. Now at its absolute bottom, just where the egg comes in contact with this surface, you'll see the darkest line. This is the contact shadow. All objects are going to have this to varying degrees. Now this one is very simple. Let's show you the next one here. On this image, you'll notice, if you pay attention to the shadows, under her elbows, even the fingertips, under her torso, you see the lighting from the studio, but you also see the contact shadow where her leg and other parts of her body come in contact with the floor. It's at its darkest, and this gives it a bit more depth, realism, and it lets you know that the object is sitting in place in the image that you're working with. Now this is one that I had done here a short while ago. Let me zoom into 100%, and without its contact shadow, the image that I had used for this composite had some dark shadows under the toes to begin with, which helped out a lot, but it left out a lot when I moved it into this image. So once throwing in the contact shadows, let me turn on its visibility here. You see the extra shadow underneath the fabric and under the toes gives it a lot more depth and lets it show that it's part of the image. Turning it off and on, and see the difference between the two. This is something that any new artist needs to look out for. It took me a little while to figure this one out myself, but here it is without the contact shadow. Let me zoom in just a little bit, and with the contact shadow. Now this appears as though it's supposed to be in the image that it's laid into. I'm going to show you how to build up on your contact shadow yourself. Okay, with this image here, this beginning of a composite, I've got the red sneaker on top of my background, and it does seem to sort of float in the image. It has no depth, it has no location. It looks okay, but it does not seem like it should be there. You can add a basic shadow, which does help. Let me turn on the visibility here for my base shadow, and it does add a little bit to it. It at least adds something of a shadow, but because of that, it acts more like a drop shadow, and it looks like the shoe is literally floating off of the wood surface. But when you add the contact shadow, that little thin darkest line in between the object and the surface, it gives it a place to sit. It looks like it should be there. So let me erase these, and we will do this ourselves, creating a new layer. What you're going to want to do is, first of all, zoom in a little bit and give yourself a brush that is fairly small. I'm going with 17 pixels, and keep the hardness at 0. You want it very soft, and take your opacity down to 75%, sometimes lower. You can also build up the line that you'll be drawing here, but I'm going to leave it at 75%. And then keeping your brush, most of it, underneath the object that you're working with, and just a little bit on the outside, you're going to trace a thin, dark, soft line around the entire length of the object, giving it that depth, giving it that feel as though it is part of your image. It will do wonders to help you with your realism and let a viewer of your image have more belief in what you've created. Now you just want to stick with the contact itself, Anywhere that, say, the shoe here will not be touching the wood surface, you won't do that contact shadow. Just to the very edge. You might also want to soften this up or cut it off a little bit sooner. But once you have that done, if your opacity is lower, you can do the same thing and build another line. Depending on the lighting, how much shadow and how deep you want that shadow to be. Once you create the line that you want, once you get that line, then it will look a lot more realistic. Being that it's on its own layer here, let's take away the base shadow, take away the background itself, and then the sneaker. This is basically all it is. A thin, soft, dark line that you've created underneath the sneaker to make it look like it's part of the image. Putting on the base shadow as well, and it looks much more realistic. It looks like it's meant to be there. Being that this contact shadow is on its own layer, if you found that you've drawn it too far down or too far up, you'd simply select your move tool. To experiment, just use the up and down arrow keys until you feel that you get it in the right position. And you've got yourself a contact shadow for your sneaker here in your composite. And you can also do this in a lot of different settings. In this image here, the baby stroller has been set in the image with a very basic shadow thrown underneath. Now we can zoom into this image and check it out with both with and without the base shadow. Either way, both of them look like they're like the stroller is sort of floating off the image. It's not as well blended as it should be. So we're going to create a contact shadow for this one, giving ourselves a new layer. There are a couple of ways we could do this with the brush tool that we did earlier. I'll lower that size down a little bit, and underneath where the wheel would be touching the floor, not the length of the entire wheel, just that little bit under the absolute bottom on both wheels, and you've got yourself a basic contact shadow. You could stretch it out a little bit further, since as with the image of the egg earlier, that contact shadow was a little bit wider than the absolute point of contact. Now that's one way that it could be done. Another way is you get your circular marquee tool, and you're going to draw yourself once you zoom in more, so you get a much better control of this. Make sure that up here you have selected the Add To selection, since we're going to create two ellipses here. You're going to start slightly on the outside of the bottom of the wheel, but higher up. Click and drag a narrow ellipse just to the edge of the wheel, just to the bottom of the wheel, as so. You're going to do the same thing with the other. And once you've got both of these ellipses created, you're going to fill them with a black. Press Ctrl D to deselect it, and we're going to blur it with a Gaussian blur and keep this very low. Gaussian blur, I set it up on this image for a radius of 2 pixels. Depending on the size of your image, you may go a little bit higher, but you don't want to go too high, or else the blur will basically almost erase your contact shadow. It won't fit as well. It'll be too invisible. But with a radius of 2 pixels, this is just fine. I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to go to 100%. And you see you have a much better image, a much better contact shadow, and a much more realistic blending of an object into the background you'll be putting it into. Okay, we're going to make another contact shadow here. With this image, I put the legs and the umbrella here in a very plain background. Adding some basic shadows into it, it helps a little bit, but it doesn't do it justice. It still, to me, looks like the shoes don't completely belong with the image, as well as the point of the umbrella. So we're going to zoom in a little bit, create a new layer. Once again, with our soft brush, you just create that thin line around the bottom of the shoe where you'll see it contacting the pavement. Sometimes if you go too far, you can always erase and retry. Now, depending on your image as well, you may not be able to simply use your arrow keys to move it up and down. Like on this one here, because of the curvature of the shoe, I can move it up a little bit, but some of the shadow will disappear more quickly than the rest. So let me get the other one here. And on this particular area, you're not going to want to add a contact shadow where you see the bottom of the pant leg. It's basically covering up part of the shoe and where the contact shadow would be seen. So you don't want to add it there. It'll make it too unrealistic and it'll stand out. So that you would skip that part of the image and move down to the heel of the shoe, continuing your circle around the edge until you get to about there. Like I said, as well as in between the two legs here, you're not going to want to add a contact shadow to those. This is not in contact with the ground, and it would just look unrealistic. Now, I see that it's a little far gone in one or two places. That could be cleaned up by adding a mask and painting away using your arrow keys, whatever you want to do. I'm just going to erase a little bit by masking it out. And the deeper your shadows are, the deeper your contact shadows are, it gives the impression of the greater distance between the object and the surface. So over here on the left, it gives me the impression that the shoe is a little bit uneven and the heel comes up off the ground a little bit more. Much like on the right shoe, you see over here where it looks like there's a little bit more space in between the shoe and the floor. Now we're going to add a very small contact shadow to the umbrella here. We're going to keep the brush about the width of the tip of the umbrella itself. Let's zoom in properly. We're going at a 345% zoom, so it's going to look a little messy this deep in. But we just do a simple click or two with a mouse now. Oh, sorry, my mistake. We are in the layer mask, so let's get back to the layer itself and not the mask with our brush at black, and now make a click or two to give the illusion of that contact shadow, and then we'll zoom out to 100%, and it looks okay underneath the bottom of it, but we're going to want to erase a little around the top. Let's go back to the mask and simply mask out some of the darker contact shadow above okay, once we have that, pull it out a little bit more and it looks okay. You might want to tighten it up a little bit, and you can always go back to the brush, go back to your layer rather than the layer mask, bring the size down a little bit, and even raise the opacity to 80% and add one more. Okay, we'll go 2. And you'll have for yourself a contact shadow underneath the tip of your umbrella. Go back out to 100%, and it looks pretty good here. It could do a little bit more refinement, a lot better light and shadow work. That's a topic for a much longer and different tutorial, but this is the basic idea here. Always remember your contact shadows. It will help bring your images together and add a lot more realism to it. In order to get a better idea of how contact shadows work and how they look, simply take a look over the internet. Google contact shadows. Google pictures. Any pictures that you have, and everybody has plenty of them. Take a look at each of them, where things come in contact with each other. Notice the contact shadows and how they work. You'll find references in nature and in your own life everywhere, so that there's no shortage of things that you can learn from. Pay attention to your lights, pay attention to your shadows, and don't forget to use your contact shadows.